from the previous session,
Okay, may I extend a very warm welcome to everybody in the room and those who are still coming in. Welcome to this session on gender disparities in fragile and conflict states, looking back and the path forward, which is a very carefully chosen title to try and encourage us to look forward. I hope you'll find it useful, and it's great to see everybody here. My name's Nick York. I'm the director in the Independent Evaluation Group of the World Bank Group, covering fragile and conflict states, among other issues. I have a manager who works for me on these issues, Marie Garda, at the front. It's great to see, among others, I gather a group of parliamentarians from different countries, of which Clara is one of the representatives, but we also have colleagues from Mali, I believe, is that right? Nigeria and other countries. So it's particularly great to see the parliamentarians here. And I can't resist, therefore, putting in a little plug. And Caroline Hyder, my vice president, who's at the back, has invited me to mention this, but I think it's quite interesting. There is actually a parliamentarian group on evaluation, which promotes the use of evidence and evaluations. So perhaps we can hook you into that. But it's lovely to have you here. It's also great to see everybody else who's made the time in this very busy and exciting Fragility Forum. My role is simply just to provide a bit of context and to welcome our panelists and ask the questions, and they'll give you all the interesting stuff. And Disha, our colleague, will provide a short presentation shortly on our evaluation that we did, just to kick things off. But just by way of context, I mean, for people in this room, it's not necessary to motivate this really, but let's just reflect on a couple of things why this is so important, so timely to be looking at the issues for gender disparities in fragile and conflict-affected states. I mean, the scale of the problem, at the moment, it's very much in the news that global forced displacement has reached unprecedented levels, and the media are focusing on it like never before, and with good reason. Having said that, nearly 2 billion people live in countries where fragility, conflict, and high levels of violence affect them, and that's not a new thing, right? So the media attention is obviously driven mainly by the displacement, and there are 60 million people who were displaced globally in 2014. So from the point of view of the World Bank Group's objectives, all our objectives of promoting development, fragile and conflict states and the people living there and the women and girls living there and the gender issues are incredibly important. Not surprisingly, according to UNHCR, women and girls comprise about half of any group of refugees and internally displaced or stateless people. And then, of course, the gender-based risks, particularly discrimination and sexual and gender-based violence, are exacerbated because then you lose the community-based structures, and the traditional formal justice systems may not necessarily protect women's rights in these situations. I think Maria will probably also remind us it's also not just about women's issues in this situation, but I'm just picking out some of the issues right now. So it's very important, and I don't need to explain that to you. I'm absolutely delighted that we did an evaluation a couple of years ago on fragile and conflict states, which had, among other things, a theme on the impact of gender issues within that. I'm absolutely delighted to have a very strong panel here who will be able to tell us about their experiences and what has been happening more recently and how we can look forward on these issues, and that's the main purpose. But just to get us started, please, if I could just introduce them individually, and then Disha will give us a presentation. So you may have seen the biographies, but the first person I'd like to introduce is Carla Koppel on the far end of the panel. She's the Vice President for Applied Conflict Transformation in the US Institute of Peace, which is an important role from this point of view, but she also was the USAID's first senior coordinator for gender equality and women's empowerment, and a senior advisor, I guess, to Raj Shah as the USAID administrator. And then she moved on to be the chief strategy officer there. She has a wide range of experience, including at the Institute for Inclusive Security, and she was at one point the interim director of the Conflict Prevention Project at the Woodrow Wilson International Centre for Scholars. So you're very welcome, Carla. We look forward to hearing your perspective, including the US government's experience, among other things, of course. Then I'm very pleased to also have Jennifer McCleary-Sills. Dr. McCleary-Sills is more from the research side of our panel. I think she is currently the Director of Gender Violence and Rights Unit at the International Centre for Research on Women, and she's done a lot of evaluations related to these issues, including gender-based violence prevention, access to justice, sexual and reproductive health, and demobilization and reintegration programs. She also used to work in the World Bank, and at that time she co-authored a book on voice and agency, empowering women and girls for shared prosperity. And she also lectures at John Hopkins at the SAIS School on these issues. I won't go into more detail. You can read the biography, which is extensive and very interesting. Now, we're very honored to have Clara Rojas, Member of Congress in Colombia, and very interested to hear her experiences, because this is a fascinating panelist and experience to draw on. She's a Member of Congress now. She's a lawyer by background, and as you probably know, she was unfortunately subjected to the experience of being kidnapped by the FARC guerrillas and lived in that situation for a number of years. She's written about her experiences in a very interesting book called Captive, and more recently she's produced 2 other books, Fireproof and Letters to Emmanuel, who is her son, I think. Correct? Yeah. So we look forward to hearing Clara's personal experiences and experiences in relation to putting gender on the map in Colombia as a high-level politician and leader. And then our final panelist is Maria Correa, who you may have just seen moderating the previous panel very effectively. She's from the World Bank. She's the lead social development specialist and has worked on a number of programs over 25 years in the World Bank. She managed the multi-country demobilization and reintegration program in the Great Lakes, among other things, and she's written a book, a publication called The Other Half of Gender, Men's Issues in Development. I think she's also very interested in innovative approaches to understanding what is at the heart of gender-based violence and social norms, attitudes and beliefs. So that's a very brief introduction to some very interesting panelists, and we look forward to hearing their views. The way this is going to run is we're going to have a short presentation from Disha to set the context of the work we did very briefly. And then we are going to invite each of the panelists to answer questions on related issues, and I'll lead them through that. We'll have 3 rounds of questions, and then finally we will open up for Q&A, which I hope we'll leave at least 20 minutes for that. We need to finish sharply at 4 because of other sessions and panelists having to leave. Okay, so over to Disha Zaidi, who is a member of our evaluation team and has worked in IG for a number of years, and did a lot of our gender-related work within the evaluation. She's going to give a short presentation.
Thanks, Nick, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm going to run you through very quickly on the evaluation report that we did a couple of years ago and what the primary gender-based findings were from this report. So that's sort of the looking back part in this session, and then looking forward would be what our panelists are going to talk about. So I'm sort of preaching to the choir here, but why do gender disparities matter in fragile and conflict situations? First, conflict affects men and women differently because of varying needs. So for example, the needs of an ex-combatant post-conflict would be different from a woman-headed household who has lost the only earning member of the family. Gender disparities are also important because coping strategies differ for men and women. For example, those who commit acts of violence have a different set of issues to deal with, whether they were forced to do this, did they do this willingly, versus those who are victims of violence. There are also other unique circumstances created due to war, like dropping out of school, increased youth unemployment, all of which makes looking at conflict through a gender lens very important. So what did we find in our analysis, which looked at World Bank engagement over a period of 10 years, going from 2002 to 2012, in 31 low-income, fragile, and conflict states. One of the things that we discovered was that in many FCS, or fragile and conflict states, laws actually discriminate against women. And especially when customary law or unwritten law trumps constitutional law. And this makes access to justice very hard. So for example, if there's a rape victim, there is no way for this person to even get to a court because they have to first go deal with the customary elder and see what they have to say. And we actually relied on a World Bank database called Women, Business, and the Law, which collects this data for a gamut of countries. There was also issues relating to laws that do not allow women access to finance. So in some countries, women had to be married to open a bank account. They had to be married to be able to get access to a small business license. And joint ownership of property was something that, again, was a big issue in conflict areas, because if a woman lost her husband, oftentimes she would not be allowed to inherit the property or the assets. So there were two big things that jumped out in the end. One was in terms of the bank context. One was that the World Bank had not specifically addressed the issue of targeted sexual violence against women in fragile states. And the second one was that the bank could have done better in having specific economic empowerment programs for women-headed households in fragile and conflict states. There were also a bunch of other takeaways relating to bank strategies, for example. So there's mainly on this slide, I have six things. The bank did not integrate gender disparities in a conflict context in several country strategies in the countries that we were looking at. Another thing that we found compelling at the project level was that even though there were disarmament demobilization programs for ex-combatants, there was often nothing running in parallel for the victims. So when we went on field work, one thing that kept coming up was, we are the victims, why weren't we helped versus the ex-combatants who now are part of employment programs. We also found that women's role in peace-building processes can be very critical, but that there was a lack of this on the whole. We also saw that there was a need to collect gender disaggregated data, and some of our panelists are going to talk about this as well, fully understanding that it's hard to collect data in fragile situations, but that there is a lack of gender disaggregated data even where there could be room for some. There is a need to prioritize medical and psychosocial needs in these settings, and also the last but not least, targeting female-headed households for programs on income generation, specifically making a difference between short-term income generation programs like Cash for Work versus long-term programs where there is some sort of skills building education that will stay with the individual versus just sort of disappearing as the program goes. So that's all I have. Now over to Nick and our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Disha. As you can see, we've kept that deliberately quite brief, but feel free to look at the evaluation on our website if you want to know more. We've also recently produced a short sort of insights note which summarises some of the gender aspects of the evaluation. Now, if I can turn to our panellists, I'll start with Maria, please. Now, Maria will know as well as anybody that the evaluation is now nearly 2 years old, and probably quite a lot has happened in the World Bank since then. So I thought I'd start by asking you, Maria, to tell us in what way these issues have been considered in the bank since the evaluation, particularly on targeted sexual violence and economic empowerment, and perhaps you could update us a little bit. And if you want to bring in the issues of men's roles in this, that would be also very welcome, but it's entirely up to you.
Thank you so much, Nick, and thank you to the IEG team, to Stephen and Disha, for organizing this, which is obviously a very important topic in the context of FCS countries. Rather than talking about the last 2 years, since, as Nick pointed out, I have been here a very long time, I thought that I would reflect on the last couple of decades and what I have seen and take a longer time horizon. From having worked on gender issues about 9 years in Latin America, followed by 9 years in Africa region, and then about 5 in South Asia region, what I've seen is actually tremendous change and improvement in terms of how we deal with gender issues, somewhat broadly, but also in the context of FCS countries and environments. And so while the IEG report paints somewhat a more negative picture of what we're doing on gender, I, from my own experience, have seen that the bank's response has been growing incrementally over time. When I left Latin America and the Caribbean in 2002, for example, on sexual and gender-based violence, we obviously had some conflict-affected and fragile environments. We weren't doing any work on this issue. Fast forward to a 2013 study, and LAC, of course, has worked on this from different contexts and has made tremendous improvement. In the Africa region, when I arrived in 2002, there was also very, very limited work on gender, and that has changed dramatically. In South Asia region, there was gender work in the context of Afghanistan, Nepal, Pakistan, but in terms of working directly on the issues that you raise, sexual and gender-based violence, that it's simply there was one small operation in Bangladesh. That situation has also changed significantly. So I think that even though these are huge topics and there's so much to be done, I think that the bank itself has made significant progress. I want to refer in terms of the sexual and gender-based violence to a 2013 study which looked at the bank's work from 2008 onwards. 44 operations, mostly in Latin America and the Africa region, that either were gender-specific interventions on sexual and gender-based violence or components of major projects, including DPLs. And there were some very significant interventions. I want to highlight one, which came out of the multi-country demobilization reintegration program that I managed from 2005 to 2010, which set up a major gender program on gender and conflict within that program, and then led to another trust fund called Logica, which was approximately $8 million trust fund, which if you look on the website, it's an amazing collection of studies and reports on pilots that were done, impact evaluation work that was done on gender and in conflict and fragile settings. So that was an amazing outcome of the work that was done in the Africa region that I don't think was captured sufficiently in the IEG report. As a result of a grant from the State and Peacebuilding Fund, there's also a platform on sexual and gender-based violence, global platform worth about $14 million, which is also significant, will bring together the experiences of 5 countries across 5 regions. In South Asia, as a result of the Delhi rape case, which happened in December 2012, we now have a 3-pronged approach to sexual and gender-based violence, which has included analytical work, addressing this issue in the context of bank operations, and a more creative program to deal with the norms underlying gender-based violence in South Asia. So really, I mean, it's from my perspective, as I said, from having been here a long time, I really see the significant change, particularly on gender-based violence. On women's economic empowerment, I think it's a bit more difficult to say. We had this discussion with Disha and Stephen, and I asked, my question was, well, how are we doing generally in terms of supporting work on economic empowerment and economic development in fragile and conflict states? And the answer was, well, we're not doing that much. And so taking that data point about we're not doing enough on gender, completely agree with the issues that Disha points out, but I think it's a bigger question of how we support fragile and conflict states in terms of economic development, in terms of employment generation, and in terms of improving access to productive resources for livelihoods. I also think that it's difficult to capture the work that we do, for example, in CDD operations. I know in the case of the National Solidarity Program in Afghanistan that we've had one of the major results of the impact evaluation of that, the largest CDD operation that the bank has financed, was specific advances in terms of improving women's leadership and in turn them then positioning themselves for access to resources in their community. And I fear that the IEG report is not able to capture those components of projects that strengthen women's economic empowerment. So just a third point, I don't want to talk too long, and I think Nick already mentioned it, and I always point it out, but I found in reading the IEG Chapter 2 that there is a need to really look at gender in from a more systems approach and looking at both men's and women's roles and how they're affected by fragility in conflict situations. Disha mentioned men as combatants, as ex-combatants, being recruited into rebel armed groups and what they face in those situations. But more generally, in fragile and conflict situations, the differentiated impact because of men's, and in men's case, because of their very, very narrowly defined economic role, and the situations, the very limited employment opportunities that exist for men, and how that affects them and makes them, puts them at risk to recruitment to crime, and other risky behaviors. So I think that that was a shortcoming of the IEG report, and we need to think about when we continue to do this important work. I do some good news. I mean, I think in terms of addressing the male and masculinity issues in FCS countries is the work that was led and financed through Logica. In the Africa region, they've done a number of studies looking at how men are both impacted and in these environments, but also how they their role on sexual and gender-based violence, and also in South Asia, we can also point to some studies on male gender issues in fragile settings, which are important. So I will leave it there as by way of introduction in terms of how I see where we are at the bank at the moment.
Thank you very much, Maria, and a very spirited defence of the bank's work, which it's interesting to hear about the South Asia work particularly and the Logica side. I'll come back to you again. We'll have broaden this out a bit in a minute. If I can just turn now to Carla Koppel and Jennifer McCleary-Sills, please. I'll come to Clara last, if I may, sorry. But on this, I think it would be useful to hear institutional perspectives on and reactions to the evaluation, first from the US perspective and then from a research perspective. So perhaps, Carla, if you could go next and give us your thoughts on these key takeaways. Thank you.
Sure. So first of all, thank you for inviting me and thank you for organizing the conversation. I think we're still in the process of really learning how we turn the very large ship of assistance in fragile and conflict-affected states to really comprehensively meet the needs of everyone within these populations effectively, and ensure that peace and prosperity is delivered for everybody within a society. So the conversation is very important. I thought the findings were really instructive, and for me, I'll present sort of an institutional perspective, particularly from my work at the U.S. Agency for International Development, where I was brought in with a very specific mandate, which was essentially to revision the attention of that bilateral donor agency to say that attention to gender issues and women's empowerment was absolutely fundamentally essential to achieving our objectives in all areas in which we worked. So there was a very explicit acknowledgement that we had siloed women and gender issues off into a little office, that we had a bunch of small interventions, and then some people in certain sectors who paid attention to gender issues and women's well-being based on their interest and compelling need within that sector. And that doesn't mean we didn't have a lot of useful projects, but there wasn't a system-wide or systematic approach and focus on attention to these issues. And I don't think there was very much a sense that of the fundamental nature of attention to these issues and the need for that to really achieve the outcomes that we were seeking. So that was kind of the starting point from where we came in. And one essential piece of the equation for us at the time, in addition to revamping of a gender policy, and at that time back then, Karen Groen, who's now leading the charge here at the World Bank, was my partner in, I would say partner in crime, but that makes it sound really bad, was my partner in advancing this and led the integration of the gender policy writ large. Another piece was focused on the National Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security, which was really focused particularly on fragile and conflict-affected states, and how the U.S. government, with USAID as one component of that, was going to drive this agenda forward for the kinds of countries in which we're working. Now, when I first came in, and this issue of, do you pick projects or do you mainstream this agenda was front and center, and I sat down to have introductory meetings, and everybody said, well, what are you going to focus on? And I sort of thought, well, if we're really going to change the way we think about these issues, I'm going to focus on everything. And they sort of looked at me in a funny way. But I really fundamentally came to believe that we couldn't look at this on a project-by-project basis, that it was a broader conversation, and really what we needed to do was make what I would call, and some people, this will bother some people, the sort of business case from a development perspective on how we move this agenda forward. And that wasn't to the detriment of the rights analysis. I believe profoundly that the rights of women and girls and the rights of everybody in society need to be honored, and we need to pay attention to this. But the reality was that this was a priority for some people, and for others there needed to be a business case. And how we approached that would vary. And so we needed to mainstream, and when you look at fragile and conflict-affected states, we needed to pay attention to this in all that we did for three reasons. First of all, because we felt it would enrich the level of analysis. Some of what was discussed here, when you talk about integrating the gendered impact of conflicts and building it into country analyses, that was absolutely fundamental to the view and the perspective we would have in countries writ large. The second was that we needed to mainstream that because those issues would arise from it. And when you look at the key takeaways and the process of analysis that was undertaken for the World Bank, you see some of that come through, because that's when you have the elevation of things like sexual violence coming out as issues where there needs to be more focus. And unless you do that overall overarching analysis, you don't see some of those things pop up where you do need to have that focused attention. And The third was that you needed to have the generalized attention because you needed to have attention to gender issues in certain segments of the endeavors you were engaging in, and you needed to see where women could also play a role, and then it would become a virtuous cycle. So one example is around disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, where we know that women play a particularly important role in each stage of that process, and particularly on the reintegration side, because they're the ones that often are maintaining communities throughout situations of conflict and state fragility. And so you build on that, and it is to your loss if you're designing a DDR intervention and you're not drawing on the particular talents of women as you're moving that work forward. So that's a piece about mainstreaming. But those specific project interventions are really important. And I would argue on issues like sexual violence, the specific focus on those interventions will be essential. Because what it enables you then to do is to focus, highlight, and really meet those essential needs in providing a means forward and to close gaps where those gaps have been identified. And that's a means by which to chart a path that ensures that you are lifting all boats. And so I would conclude by giving some of the lessons from the generalized experience of USAID, and I think there are three big lessons. One is, in addition to the specific conversations that are the takeaways coming from this evaluation and this conversation, you need to really work on changing the frame of reference writ large. It needs to become a conversation about how you build the best kinds of interventions that are possible, and a broader recognition that that requires you to pay attention to gender dynamics within fragile and conflict-affected states. The second is you need to give people not just the analysis, but the tools to carry forward the work that you're doing. So you lay out what the problem is, and you enable them then to answer the question of how can I make this intervention better and move the agenda forward. And then the third is you take from that the specific interventions that need to be undertaken. And I would argue that issues like sexual violence and conflict is one of those where you need to have a specific focus. I think that is less the case on economic empowerment, because I think at the end of the day, the economic empowerment, if you are designing an intervention for the economic empowerment of a society, then that de facto should be designed to meet the needs of everybody within that society, with a gendered analysis informing the way you develop and implement those projects. There will, of course, at times be need for specific interventions, but where you end up in terms of those two issues, sexual violence and economic empowerment, I think are two different things. And I think the experience at USAID has borne that out. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Carla. So, Jennifer, you've written on economic empowerment. What are you all thinking?
Yes, so I want to say first I was nodding vigorously because I agree with so much of what Carla just said. And just reflecting on these findings, I think for those of us that work in this field, those of us that focus on gender inequality, that focus on women's economic empowerment, we're not surprised at all to find that there are programs that have missed the mark on this. I certainly hear what Maria is saying, that the past few years the bank has done a lot more and has some really useful findings to offer from recent operations, but it's not a surprise to us to see that there's a gap. I just want us to pause, though, and recognize that this gap in FCS context, this gap when it comes to DDR programs, is not unique. For all development programs, we see that there's a gap when it comes to gender equality. There's a gap with regard to a specific emphasis on the needs of women as it comes to development concerns and development programs. So we're looking at a specific microcosm, right, within this fragile setting. So the findings aren't terribly surprising, but in terms of the key points, again, both to what Maria started us off with, the idea that we need to look at gender from more than one angle. I hesitate to say both angles, because I actually think we need to be much more explicit in thinking about gender not as a binary, but thinking about, yes, the needs of men and women and people that are along the spectrum in their identity. So we're not just thinking about this binary two options, particularly understanding that LGBTI people in times of peace, but also in times of fragility, are going to have dramatically increased risk. So that's the first piece. When we think about the gendered risk, then why do we often end up speaking only about women? It's because of the underlying gender disparities. And I think all of us probably know that on some level, but I want us to be cautious about jumping to the conclusion that doing gender-sensitive work or having gender-responsive DDR programs means just adding women and stirring, because it doesn't mean that at all. To the mainstreaming point, sort of mainstreaming versus targeting, it's a tension that we have in this field, and Carla's underlined some of the underlying factors of that tension really well. I would say that from the perspective of a researcher who works very much with an operational lens, it's important for us to do both. We're thinking about what it is that we do now, what we can and should be doing. It's both targeting and mainstreaming. The ideal, eventually, is that we would have this lens, this gender equality lens, so thoroughly integrated into the work that we do that it wouldn't have to be a standalone, separate lens that we apply. It wouldn't have to be a separate gender needs assessment. It would just be part of the needs assessment that's inbuilt. But we're not there yet. So the useful part of the targeted interventions, just to add to what Carla's pointed to, it does ensure that we actually are paying attention to the right things, that we're paying attention to the gender disparities, to the gender dynamics, whether we're talking about men or about women. It also gives us an opportunity to really pressure test some solutions. So we have a small pilot perhaps, and we can look at what is working and whether that is in fact reducing some of the disparity. Is it, in the case of some of the work that the IEG looked at, improving women's economic empowerment? And those give us a really useful opportunity then to provide case studies, right? And make the business case, though many of us don't like to say that, we have to. Not everyone is moved to do this work because of the human rights lens, so we sometimes find ourselves in the position of making the business case. The targeted approach gives us those opportunities. On the flip side, though, when we're thinking of mainstreaming, which I really hold that as the ultimate goal, it's an opportunity to get really broad-based attention to the issue of gender inequality in a program across sectors, right? So it's not just a program focused on sexual violence and conflict, but it is a broad DDR program that is allowed to then have a focus on gender disparities, including risk of violence. The balance there, though, is that we don't want to dilute the focus on those very specific needs or have them be eclipsed by the larger, what are often seen as more pressing needs of the big program. But I do think that if we're able to do both of these over time, we'll find a way to really be true to the intention, which is to have gender equality as a cross-cutting theme that does truly cross-cut, that isn't just added on. I think that's unfortunately where we are with a lot of this work. Again, on the issue of approaching this from sort of a research perspective, the work that I've done and some of my colleagues have done from ICRW has looked very critically at DDR programs in particular and at whether and how gender has been integrated. And much like the findings here, we find that there are some significant gaps. Yes, in terms of addressing gender-based violence and addressing women's economic empowerment, but some of the larger gaps that we see are actually in this lens of what the gender inequalities actually mean, and looking at an assets-based approach. So we're always, I think, comfortable looking at women and their vulnerability and the risk that they experience, particularly in times of fragility, but not looking at the assets that they bring and the opportunities that they bring as change agents and change makers in their community. So that's an important gap in all of the programs that I've evaluated. And on the flip side of that, we're often very comfortable with the idea of looking at men as the aggressors and the perpetrators of crime, but not understanding that they are also victimized by this fragility, either because they themselves have been raped in the war or because just the simple erosion of their social fabric has destroyed communities in which the men also live. So those are some of the things that we always underscore when we're doing an evaluation, to really look at what we mean when we talk about gender disparities in these fragile contexts.
Already a lot to think about. I'm going to turn now to Clara, and perhaps I could ask you, Clara, to do two things to get us moving on the discussion. One is to react, of course, from your Colombian perspective and knowledge of these issues to the evaluation, but also if you could move us into the next stage of the discussion, which is how one goes about ensuring that gender issues are put on the map and kept there. And what's your experience that you've learned on that? Thank you.
Thanks. The first thing that I like to say is many thanks to invite me to be here. I like to give the thanks also to NDI that invite me to participate, and I'd be really honored to be here share with you. As you know, in Colombia, we are in a peace process involved, and we expect that the government and the parties is going to sign the agreement in the next few months, maybe in the next few weeks. But I'd like to first say you some data about my view about how is the condition of the woman in the country. Violence against women. In Colombia, there are feminicide over in 2014, according to the National Institute of Legal Medicine, there were 1,000 cases of feminicide. During this period were 177 deaths, women deaths under age, as a 12% in women to 20 to 39 years. That's a 50%. It's a very largest rate for us, right? The figures reflect a complex situation. In 2015, 20,000 cases of violence met physics against the women, male more than 2004. Among the violent attacks against women behind the location in the marriage in their houses is the largest attack rate. Equally worrying for the authorities, the victims were girls and adolescents under 10 years. We are really worried about the problem in Colombia. The other big problem is the teen pregnancy. More than 150,000 pregnancies in between girls to 10 to 19 in the last 20,000 or 50. Well, is a big figure, right? One of the 5 Colombian adolescents between 50 and 19 have ever been pregnant. During 2013, more than 5,000 babies were born mothers under age between 10 and 40 years. Education. In Colombia, the higher education is very important. We recognize the work in the government. But in the labor market, the inequality persists. That women have higher levels of education, but also the men, on average, earn more than the women in all those categories, except in the less remunerated activities. It's very, it's crazy. Women's participation in employment in Colombia has increased in the last years. In relative with the man, the occupation of women in self-employment with 41% on November 2015. 90 million women of working age were in Colombia, 11% unemployment. I like when I hear Maria about the programs of the bank, World Bank. I thinking briefly thinking about it's important to create a fund maybe, because the largest side of the woman don't have the opportunity to have a formal job, right? And we have to take care about the family. No? In Spanish, you say madres cabeza de hogar. It's around 50 million women. It's very largest figure, right? And I think we have to work on, because we have to carry all the family, all the kids. It's really a big problem. The other thing in the labor market is the pension. Women, like it's informal job, right? They don't have the opportunity to apport to the social security system. In this case, the problem is they can obtain, when they are old, the opportunity to obtain the pension. This is very inequality situation also. Political participation is better because we have the law of quotas, and we are increase the participation also in senator. Now we have 23 women, and in the House of Representatives around or 33 seats. Is better than the last election, but we are working to promote the equal participation, because we feel it's necessary to working on have a better condition for the women in all the country. But the other point that is important to say is about the conflict in the humans. How is the sexual violence affect us? We calculate that about 7 million victims, the 50% are women, around 3.5 million women, right? It's a very huge figure. Humans in post-conflict, we expect that the best condition we are working to make to have the possibility or to provide the access to the health service, education, labor in equal conditions. And I think it's very important that that kind of programs, as Kasla says before, is necessary to obtain the focus, right? Because you can say the results in any matter. I recognize that the government advanced, and we have many laws, we have many politicals, but I say that the big problem in Colombia is the implementation of the laws, is the implementation of the political, is the follow-up to the information that they have made, right? In Colombia, we have a special council for women problems, and they have to follow up around 26 institutions to have programs about humans, right? But yes, already the last week, I tried to did political control, and the problem of the big issue is very difficult to do the follow-up, because they don't have the information about how is the result of the programs, right? Sorry with my English, it's not very fluent, because today we have very hard agenda.
Your
But
English is a lot better than my Spanish.
Yes,
so,
but
yeah, don't
I am
worry.
so happy to be here and try to send you a message that we, of course, need to improve and advocacy for World Bank and many institutions and in abroad to try to implement good programs from the governments in Colombia. Thank you.
Yeah. So thanks to all our panel. I think we've had quite an interesting first round. If we can now move into a slightly different sort of level of discussion, can I ask you briefly just to reflect on what you've learned about how to really put gender on the map and to keep it there from your long and distinguished careers in various institutions and different contexts? I mean, there's a vast amount of knowledge here. So if we could start with Carla, please, and then come back to Maria last. Thanks.
I think there are three key ingredients. I think the first I mentioned earlier, which is really making that case and making it as compellingly as possible and speaking in terms of the sectors in which you're working. So if you're talking about working with people who are focused on economic development, how does attention to gender issues and to women and men differentiate in a differentiated way deliver better results for economic development? And I think when you're dealing with technical people, that's absolutely essential. I think the second is we really have to up our game in terms of the presentation of data and results. I think that when we show both a differentiation in terms of status and needs, and then we show a difference in terms of the results achieved from a project intervention or activity, then it becomes a virtuous cycle that is self-reinforcing. And so you then don't need to keep making the same case over and over again. And then I think the third is to enable women and men to be spokespeople for the issues within their own context. There is nothing more persuasive and more important than local stakeholders being given the opportunity to speak for themselves, to elevate their voices, and to help shape project interventions in the ways that make sense within that context. And not to forget that they really are the change agents that will transform their own societies and move the agenda forward. And so I think that's how you make it stick, and that's how you move the agenda forward in ways that will be durable.
Thank you. Jennifer?
Sure. I have 4 points, so I make that 7 we'll have. I think I would focus more on specifically this question at hand: how do we keep gender issues at the core of what we're doing in FCS, and it resonates a lot with what Carla's said. As I mentioned before, the idea of it being a true gender-sensitive approach, right? So not just assuming that if we have women in the program or we're addressing a single need of women's, that means we have a gender-sensitive approach. So it would be the first to really focus on that, broadening the definition. The next would be to think about all of the domains of an individual's life that are then affected by, in this case, fragility. And I think that Clara's description of some of the challenges in Colombia give us a really clear sense of what those domains are. The OECD, when they look at fragility, names 5 domains. So it's violence, I think that's an obvious one. Justice also feels obvious in light of what we've talked about today. Institutions, or the lack of strong institutions, economic foundations, and resilience. And I think that's the one that we have the hardest time with. And it's very reductive when we think women's issues in FCS are just about getting raped and just about having money. Obviously, those are at the core of a lot, but there are many other domains we have to think about to have a holistic approach. Another would be, to the point about data, having better measures of success. So how do we know if a reintegration program has actually succeeded? How do we know if within that a woman-focused economic empowerment intervention has succeeded? We have to understand that simply giving increased income does not equal empowerment. So what measures can we have to really show, both to make the business case, but also to show what's working, to really document our solutions? How do we better measure things like empowerment, like resilience, like reintegration, and whose ideas get captured there? There's some fascinating work out of Sierra Leone that actually looks at exactly that question. If you ask young female ex-combatants what good reintegration looks like, they will tell you something very different than a program designer might come up with, and those are critical learnings that we have. The fourth piece, I would say, is if we really want to keep this on the map and do it well, we have to give practitioners tools. We can't just say integrate this lens, do something about women's and men's needs. You have to really help people understand how to do that. And I would be remiss if I didn't make a plug, especially since you're here, Diana, for a resource guide that the World Bank developed in partnership with the IDB and with my institution, ICRW, and the Global Women's Institute at George Washington University. This is focused on violence against women and girls, but it is one of the tools that we're talking about that helps practitioners really understand, how do you do this? What are the entry points? Do we have to have only targeted programs? Can we mainstream? And this is really trying to answer all of those questions. These cards are on the table. Thanks.
So, Clara, I suppose one way to put gender issues on the map and get people's interest is to write 3 best-selling books, but not everybody can do that. In terms of within Congress and government, how have you, what strategies have you used?
Well, since Congress, the best handle, it will be to control the authorities, right, and to follow up them. But regarding with the books, please take note that my second book is about resilience. Remember, I was kidnapping. And I think the resilience is the best, the most important thing, because you need the advocacy of the community to have the opportunity to entrance in a new life, right? I think the company is very important, no? To have the opportunity, especially from the victims, not only sexual cases, only all the cases. I think it's very important to open mind in the people, in the community, in the society, to try to understand. In Colombia, we have a special cátedra for women, right? In the college, in the school, they'll try to show how is the important to say a woman, to work in the identities of both sex, and I think those handles are important also to try to open the spaces for the women.
Thank you. And last but not least, Maria.
The benefit of going last is that I can agree with everything that has been said before me. But I wanted to point to a couple of things in particular. What Carla mentioned in terms of making the business case. I think we've had some very important reports come out of the bank recently that make the case, including, of course, the obvious, the WDR for gender, which is obviously a broad document, but still was an important important milestone for the bank, the 2014 Voice and Agency report, which Jennifer, I guess you co-authored. And then now more recently, the new bank gender strategy, which also includes this as a pillar. So I think that's obviously really important in terms of making the case. And on the importance of data and results and this virtuous cycle, I think we've seen how the Logica program in sub-Saharan Africa has been such an important program in the bank to both pilot interventions, do impact evaluation, and then disseminate those results. And I think we need to think about how we can replicate those kinds of programs and make them more sustainable, so we build off that important work. And I should say something that I didn't mention in my introductory remarks, which was so important, is that all of this work led to a $107 million operation in the Great Lakes region involving 3 countries. So this was building off of the recent work. I wanted to just maybe point to a couple of other things that I think are important. One is taking advantage of a certain space that can be opened up. And I think that was the case of the MDRP. I've heard some criticism already in the table, and also in Disha's report about how DDR programs are not responsive on gender. Having managed the largest DDR program in the world and knowing what the constraints were, I have a lot to say about that. But one good thing that came out of it was that we did develop, we established a gender program, which eventually led to the Logica program that I told you about, which you can say was a precursor to the $107 million operation. So that was taking advantage of a space that allowed us a larger space on a very specific project. Or a specific program on DDR to build a gender program. I think that the work in South Asia was also taking advantage of a moment, and obviously a horrendous incident in Delhi, which got global attention, but really allowed us to talk for the first time about a very, very sensitive issue in South Asia. It still is a sensitive issue, but to take advantage of those moments, I think, is really important, at least from my experience personally. As a non-policy person, I think is what has allowed me to bring different agendas forward. Finally, I think it's important to think creatively about these projects. One of the things that came out of our work in South Asia, in addition to a more conventional analysis, very important analysis of violence against women and girls in South Asia, and interventions in projects on specifically on gender-based violence, was a program that we called We Evolve, which works in the creative industries to address the underlying norms behind gender-based violence and focusing on women and men. And to give you an example of that, we are supporting a comic book character called Priya Shakti. So this is to reach teens and preteens. Priya Shakti is a previous rape survivor and hero, superhero. This comic book, has reached in its first year a population across South Asia, and it's gotten great media attention. And the World Bank is supporting the 3rd chapter, which looks at acid victims and introduces the male perspective of why the men actually use this or carry out this hideous crime. So I think it's important to think creatively about these difficult issues, in short.
And yes, if we can just finish off the panel questions by asking the other panelists to just highlight any sort of cutting edge or new issues or new approaches that you want us to think about in relation to these issues. What is it that you're currently looking forward on, and what do you think we should be focusing on going forward? Thank you. Perhaps, actually, Clara, would you like to answer that next, please?
Well, maybe the most important thing is to try to listen the communities of the women in real ground, right? To try the approximate the programs, the construction or the building of the projects together in order to obtain the best results, I suppose, especially in communities in the region, in the local areas with the indigenous people that are really affected. I think it will be very important to try and work on to have best results in the middle time, right?
I would agree entirely with Maria's idea that you need to be creative, and I've seen a lot of really creative attempts to address some of these issues. Some of the ones that come to mind immediately when you raise the question are from the Eastern DRC, which I think everyone is familiar with how challenging that context can be. Some of the things that I saw there that really inspired me and made me very hopeful for change were not necessarily focused on the gender lens, but just on this very participatory approach to engaging community and really rebuilding the social fabric that had been destroyed by a generation of conflict. They have peace schools, which bring this nonviolent and gender equitable set of messages within the schools, and the children then bring that home, and it's showing really promising results. Similarly, you'll find a theme in the names, but the Peace Caravan, which involves men and women, and particularly young people from the community, to go to other communities and actually build peace. And there are, in fact, women on the very front lines of this peace-building movement. And some of the simple markers of success are things like people from neighboring communities shopping at each other's markets again, something which hadn't happened after so many years of mistrust. So I think these are some of the really creative ways that we're seeing resolutions to both the issue of gender disparities, because you have women playing roles that they weren't previously playing, and also to the peace challenges. And I would say just, broadly speaking, it's an example I gave before, but participatory methods, whether we're talking about understanding what the challenges are that men and women face, or the challenges that boys and girls face, or LGBTI people face, that's a really useful tool. Capture the voices of those who are experiencing the challenges. Also, again, capture what they can contribute. So it's not just a vulnerability-based approach, but an assets-based approach. And the example I gave before, looking at ways to better measure the success and using the voices of those who are experiencing that success and those changes is a really critical way forward. And I think we'll see more of that in the near future.
Today I happen to be speaking in threes, so forgive me. But I would highlight three things, not shockingly. The first is, I think that in addition to the issue of mainstreaming versus project-specific interventions, I think there's a real need to look at underlying root causes of differentiated sort of levels of economic wealth within societies. And when I'm talking about underlying issues, I'm talking about things like what is the legislative framework and how do we address those issues as part of our interventions, whether it relates to land tenure rights of women versus men, whether it relates to constitutional privileges, banking rights, inheritance rights, and all of this is laid out in the publications like Women, Business, and the Law that the World Bank publishes, but then how do you fold that into the intervention and the structure of those interventions within fragile and conflict-affected states? And I think that that's really a way to structurally change the equation for the long term. The second is, I think that we really need to look at the way we deal with women as participants, both in peace processes broadly defined, and then operationalize that through the way that we develop participatory interventions. And so we still don't have nearly enough women's voices in the negotiation back to peace and prosperity and the resolution of conflict. And until we do that, we're not going to have our fingers on the pulse of all of these issues because we can't possibly. The voices need to be direct, on point, and action-oriented. And so we need to create that space. And then the third is, I think we need to look more at women as change agents within our project interventions. I'll wear my USIP hat for a second, my new new hat. And we have a really interesting intervention, and I don't know if Clara's familiar with it, but that works with women as mediators in Colombia and their role in really preventing the outbreak of violent conflict. And the interesting thing, I've been introduced to this intervention very recently, but what it interestingly parallels at USAID was that when we put in place the National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security, one of the most rapid increases we saw in the role of women in peace processes and the interventions we were implementing through bilateral assistance was women as mediators. In all different places all around the world. There's clearly a very natural role, whether it's the cultural constructs in different locations, whether it's the approach to dialogue that women bring, whether it's their roles in societies, families, and communities. But that was something that organically evolved, and I've seen it be really, really successful in a number of different places. And when I traveled, for example, to Kenya, and they were talking about conflicts in the Horn, I had a discussion with a third generation peace building project that AID was implementing. They said each generation we've involved women as our agents for promulgating peace building more and more and more. And I said, well, why is that? And they said, well, because it works better. And I thought that was, an interesting comment, but it really speaks to how we need to change the way we think about women in situations of fragility and conflict to understand the tremendous value they can bring as partners in project design and implementation and evaluation and monitoring as well.
Yeah, and just picking up on one point that was made earlier on, the value of catching children when they're very young and the education aspect of it. I used to live in Scotland where there's a lot of conflict between different religious groups, and it was quite instructive how quickly they managed to change values there by making it very clear in elementary schools that religious bigotry was not acceptable, including not allowing children to wear any sort of symbol or colours relating to the sort of allegiances that were so conflicted in that city where we lived. And it really, not only did it make a difference to the children, but I think it communicated to their parents. So that was an interesting experience. Now this is where we open up the, we haven't got quite as much time left as I'd hoped because we started slightly late, but we've got about 15 minutes for questions. If you could come to the mic to indicate that you want to ask a question, we'll take a round of about 5 or 6 questions and then see how we're doing for time. So, yes, please.
Good afternoon, all of you. Thank you for your presentation.
Please, could you introduce yourself as well?
My name is Rosemary Sekero. I'm the president of Hope for Tomorrow, an organization based in Washington, D.C. We focus on conflicts and violence. And thank you for your presentation. Looking at all your presentations, I can see you are all great and you talked well, especially Carla, where he says, you need to give a voice to the people, to the community, to the women, especially those and victims. Where are they on the table? What are the results, the impact that you have done on the ground, especially in Africa? I'm talking on behalf of Africa. So those people needs to be here to tell us, yes, you did something on the ground and we are seeing success and the impact of what you are doing. We're just hearing your story. So, and also the problem is civil society, non-profit organization, and the government. The government doesn't want to work with the civil society. Civil society doesn't want to work with the government, not because of anything, because that collaboration and coordination is not there. Because if it was then we'd be not talking here. But how do we work with the government, with you guys, and the World Bank? We were here last year, we're still talking again, we'll be here next year. What is the impact on the ground? How do we work together to make it happen, not only to come and hear another story of a story, another story. So please let us know and bring the victims on the table too. Let us hear their stories. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Meskaram Georges. I'm an Ethiopian national and I go to the School of Public Policy at George Mason, and I also work part-time for a local nonprofit, Global Women Peace Foundation, based in the Washington, D.C. area. So my question is, I grew up in Ethiopia, and I've been in the U.S. for 10 years now, so I have a very recent collection of how women are treated there. You can have the highest education, but there is a culturally accepted norm of just pervading gender inequality. So no matter how much the women is educated, they try to fulfill the quota system if the parliaments have quota systems. But other than that, we don't get a good fair amount of opportunity to work and make the necessary influence when it comes to policy or implementation. The other approach that I was looking at was, how about the cultural education using the local folks? Because I've seen people located in the small villages or towns or field, they're hands off. They don't want an outsider telling them about their own culture. So using the insider's perspective to bring the shift of change would be highly influential. The other thing that I was thinking about is incentivizing the governments, in these foreign governments, to actually adhere to percentage requirements when it comes to giving opportunity to women. That will force the governments, because we've seen a lot of funding going into a black hole and not having the necessary changes that we've been having. So unless there's the I'm sorry to say this, but there's a forceful approach from the donor society to see a practical way of attacking things, I don't think we're going to see the results anytime soon. So that was the two things that I wanted to ask about. Thank you.
Okay, Karen, please.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for really interesting presentations. I'm Karen Matheson. I'm in the U.S. Executive Director's Office, and we're about to embark on the replenishment of IDA 18, and two of our themes are fragility and gender. And so I'm hopeful that we'll make some gains on this in this particular areas. But my question is actually about the refugee communities, because we are starting to look at a role for the bank related to refugees really for the first time, and particularly really protracted crises where, you have humanitarian agencies still in second and even third generation camps. So I'm wondering if any of you have experience with those populations and would want to share anything. And then also very quickly, if you see in this particular areas of gender and fragility, any role for the private sector, which is something that we, in terms of creative thinking, have been looking at, but no obvious solutions present themselves. Thank you.
Okay, I'll take these last three, and then we'll come back to the panel and see how we're doing for time. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm called Esther Kere Luzai. I work with from South Sudan. I work with the Ministry of Gender, Child and Social Welfare. I have three issues to share with you here. When we look into the findings of this evaluation, they talk a lot about access to finance and starting a business. And it has come out clearly from the discussion that issues of access, not only, but also we have issues of ownership and control of productive resources. So I'm wondering whether we are really taking that comprehensive package in the area of economic empowerment. Are we really looking into issue of access, ownership, and then control of productive resources, which is a very common case in fragile states. And particularly when we look into the case of South Sudan, access is one thing, ownership is another, and then control of resources becomes also the third element. And during that this discussion, we need also to look into the cultural context, which have an impact on empowering women, particularly, and also it creates gender disparities in that angle. The second issue is the issues of customary laws overriding statutory laws, which is also very important. And how can we come out from that? Because in fragile states, customary laws override statutory laws. And then it denies women access to justice. It takes long for them to access justice, but also an area of legal aid. how can we provide legal aid to women, particularly in fragile states, so that they can also access justice? Because some of them have no resources to go through the court procedures. So we need to bring out clearly the issue of legal aid. The third area that has come out clearly also is the issue of women, peace and security, which is also relevant in fragile states. And taking into consideration the case of South Sudan, we developed the NAP, which is the National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. And through the NAP, Clara has brought it clearly how the mediation process has come out very successfully in Africa. And even after the post-conflict recovery, what next? This takes us also back to Jennifer's presentation about we need both targeted actions, which will come out in the Women, Peace and Security program. Also, we need mainstreaming through those processes. Thank you.
And would you like to?
I'm Harriet Lamb from International Alert, peace building organisation. I wanted to ask Clara, from the point of view of the Colombian government, once the peace agreement is signed, what do you think are the most important things to be done to engage the private sector in helping build peace, and in particular enabling women to participate in that as well?
Thank you.
Thanks. My name is Michael Wilson. I'm from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for Australia, but formerly AusAid's gender coordinator, so I had a similar job to Carla's within the Australian Development Agency. I think we still too often talk about gender equality in terms of technical approaches and technical solutions, when of course gender is about politics first and foremost. So I wonder, this is really to Carla and Maria, in your two organisations, do you think there are lessons in terms of how gender as an issue got to the top of the agenda that gives you or gives us some power and influence over convincing partner organisations and governments why it should be treated the same way in their own jurisdictions?
Mm-hmm. Okay, what I'll do is go to each of the panellists in turn, and if you can pick up on any questions that were either directed at you or that you particularly want to comment on. I think some of the points were points rather than questions, but please feel free to react. I'll start with Carla, please.
Sure. So I think a number of the questions and points focused on the sort of local norms, and I think that it's incredibly important to elevate the local voices. Too often we default to the most conservative voices in societies and say that that is actually the norm within those societies, when there's a significant, often majority of the people that actually believe that it's time for change, both men and women, and time for progress. And so I think it's important that we highlight that all the time, and to elevate the voices that are the voices for a different view in society, whether it's Ethiopia or elsewhere. And I remember working in Afghanistan, when you started to have male allies for women's rights willing to speak out, then you know that you're starting to see change within society. And I think that's the way you really get that change to progress. I think the issue of the private sector role on IDA 18 and fragility and gender is a really important and big question, particularly when you look at the volume of financial flows and relative flows. And I think that one of the questions is thinking, as a World Bank or a bilateral donor, what is it you can do to incentivize the flow of resources from others, including the private sector, to move that agenda forward? And I think that obviously you need to segment what you mean by the private sector, but it needs to be those that are either willing and able to move into riskier environments, or are there, and often those are folks or companies, for example, that are working on natural resources, and so they're forced to be in environments where there may be a attendant risk involved, because that's where the resources are. I think if you're talking about foundations and others, it becomes a different conversation, and I'd be happy to have more of a discussion about that. I think the issue of customary law is really important, and it gets to the question that was raised earlier about what are the things that we need to be paying attention to. And I think too often when we go into fragile and conflict-affected states and we're dealing in a post-conflict environment, we're too willing to just default to customary authorities and customary law as an okay way to drive a path forward. And I think we need to be more analytical in our approach to doing that, because often what that does is it actually set societies back. Where there's been a lot of progress in a pre-conflict stage, there's laws in place that were respected and accepted by everybody, and we revert because we say, oh, well, customary law has been there a long time, when actually the society has moved quite substantially forward. So I think that critical assessment is really important. And then with regard to how you get it to the top of the agenda, I think there's a combination of two things. One is a real leadership commitment, and a leadership commitment that is explicit, not implicit, but they're willing to say that this matters, they're willing to put energy behind it, and they're willing to drive it forward and hold people accountable for that. I think the second is a combination of carrots and sticks. That is accountability measures and mandatory references and actions that individual staff and program need to take, along with incentives that reward those that are moving the agenda forward quickly, efficiently, and effectively. I'd be happy to talk in greater depth about how we handle that at AID.
Thank you. We're running out of time, so we'll have to leave that. But Jennifer, please. Yeah.
Sure. I will just pick up on a couple of the points. I think first to Rosemary's question about local voices, I agree with you. And we do more than just kind of keep saying that and talking about it. In the work that we do at ICRW, all of our work is very participatory. And when we have the opportunity, we do engage those voices as speakers, as presenters, and as co-authors on papers, all of those things. So I agree, and it's something that we all need to do better at. The couple of the other things I just wanted to pick up on, I think the issue of customary law, I would agree with what Carla said, that we often end up just defaulting to that. What we do find, of course, and it won't surprise anyone here, but customary law so often does not pay much attention to women's voice and agency, and it often, that default means that their voices are silenced, and the idea that they're accessing this justice system maybe is true, but are they actually accessing justice? And who defines what that justice looks like? It's work that my team and I are doing right now. We'll soon be publishing an ICRW publication called Who's Justice? Who's Alternative? But it's looking at exactly that question in more stable environments, but I think it's just sort of emphasized when we're looking at a fragile context. The question that, Karen, you raised about the role of private sector, I think Carla's already attempted that, and it's just to say we're struggling to answer that question as well, and we're doing some landscaping for some of our current work in South Sudan and in Pakistan to figure out how is it that we can engage the private sector, and what are the ethics we need to take into consideration when we're doing that, right? Because obviously a huge influx of money can be very appealing, but is that actually creating more problems than it is solving? And so it's one of our big kind of litmus test questions right now. I think the final point, our colleague from South Sudan, the question about the comprehensive package, and it goes very much to the point that I raised about what we're measuring and how when we say we're empowering women, are we really just giving them money? The field of work that I'm engaged in, this is what we do all the time, and try to really think about what those measures are. And the example I gave earlier about how do we know if we're getting it right? Well, you ask the women. You ask them what success looks like. You ask them if they are in fact more empowered or just have more money. And we can do that with all of the measures and all of the programs, so that we're really understanding where we are in that continuum, and making sure that we're moving from just simple giving of cash to real agency over that cash, and having it be transformative.
Thank you, Clara. And particularly one of your questions that was directed at you was the role of the private sector if,
Yes,
after
the peace process.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it's very important, of course, the participation of private sector. The government estimates that the guerrillas are going to put in a special zone that the name is called concentration zones. They expected it will be around 7 million people, 7 million persons. It's many persons in different areas of the country. I think it's very important that the support of private sector, the offer to jobs, to capacitation, to everything, because they have to begin this the first day, right? Because they have other background. They have to learn how can they live in the social civility as the same person. I think it's very important not only in the Colombia, maybe abroad. We need more investment in the country to offer many jobs for those people. The other thing is about justice. Our College of Sudan talking about the importance of the justice. For example, in Colombia, the level of impunity is around 98%. It's really high, right? I think it's very important to improve the institutions to access the governments to have the opportunity to access to the justice. It's a very important point to work on, right?
Very quickly, I just wanted to make a pitch for some very specific references, or not references, but allocations of IDA 18 specifically for gender and FCS countries. I think that I started by saying that I thought we advanced a lot, but still, I mean, these are huge issues. They are still very difficult to finance, and I think that we need to make very explicit reference and actually set aside money for these issues in FCS countries. Just another comment on the private sector. I think we need to think again creatively of how we work with the private sector. Are we thinking about just getting money? That's one point. I have recently discovered that there are all kinds of sources in the private sector that I didn't know much or anything about, including private philanthropists that are very interested in these issues. There's tremendous wealth out there. There are impact investment firms that are also there's things that we just, because we tend to think very narrowly with our development hats, we don't think about how we can work creatively with the private sector. And I have some examples of how we've done that in our We Evolve program in South Asia. Thank you.
So one of the things I'm going to do is go away and look at the Logica program that you were talking about. Thank you very much. Can I just, on a note of optimism, tell you about a little experience I had a couple of weeks ago. I was in Zambia presenting an evaluation to the Zambian government. I was very pleased with the level of interest they showed, and they're dealing with quite challenging issues right now. But the most encouraging thing I saw was a very impassioned and impressive speech by a CSO representative, Diakoni in Zambia, and it was by a colleague called Olivia Luabukana. I haven't pronounced her name correctly, but she, and I emphasize she, they took the government to task really strongly in a very powerful speech from a CSO in a public forum. And the government, to their credit, didn't react defensively, but it was an interesting example of voice and accountability because it was about use of public resources. Very articulate, very well supported by the CSO, clearly. And I thought was encouraging. I mean, it was something that made me feel optimistic on these issues. And Zambia is, of course, an IDA country, so from that point of view, it's quite relevant. I've been really thrilled by the participation and the panel. We've been very lucky to have them. So please show your appreciation to them and to Disha for her presentation. And my thanks also to you for participating, particularly to our parliamentary colleagues. It was very nice to have you here, and I hope you have a good week. Thank you.